With The Force Awakens released in 2015, The Last Jedi released in 2017, and The Rise of Skywalker released in 2019, the response to these films have been overwhelmingly negative from movie audiences and film critics to even the Star Wars fans, and yet the films have made a total combined profit of $4 billion US. Why? What's the reason for this? The answers are actually quite complex and interconnecting. The original Star Wars films were released in 1977, 1980, and 1983. The proposed ideas for additional films that were different from what we later got in the late 2010s were actually first mentioned all the way back in 1976, according to Mark Hamill, that George Lucas had told him that he had the idea for the three trilogy movies after the original three films. Time magazine had a printed story from March of 1978 where, quoting Lucas, that there would be a total of 10 films set after The Empire Strikes Back, that people associated with the Star Wars films had proposed ideas for screenplays before 1980. Further information from 1980 mentions Lucas had the idea for 7 films and not 10, but either source from Hamill or Time says that George Lucas had a rough idea for an expanded Star Wars film-based universe besides the original 3 films. The ideas that George Lucas had were consistently and constantly changing at the time, and it could have been easily different if the films had been implemented at that time in the early 1980s from what he had in his mind to what could have been put into possible films. Important facts that the proposed original sequel films before 1983 were the focus being that of Luke's journey to becoming the premier Jedi. Luke's sister. The concept of Luke's sister would have been an entirely new character, but later on, through events and circumstances, it was of course natural and eventual that Leia would be recalled into being Luke's sister. New characters, worlds, and storylines that would have brought new life into the franchise. It's now fully impossible to imagine what Lucas might have had envisioned due to various circumstances occurring since the 1980s. The story being about a quote-unquote older Luke Skywalker in his 30s or 40s. Once Return of the Jedi was released, certain aspects of the films were now Star Wars lore and canonically could not be changed. Lucas originally had his ideas for films before the final one at the time, and some of his ideas were adjusted to later fit the canonical timeline established by the 3 films. Important facts that the proposed original sequel films after 1983 were: the films would have dealt with the period of time that the Galactic Republic was being rebuilt. Instead, the concept would have had a time within the Galactic Republic already been built, and that the films would have taken place after this chronological fact. The idea of Luke being involved with a woman was later discarded, mostly due to the fact that in the original 3 films, he didn't necessarily have a love interest at all, and to have one later on wouldn't make much sense with Luke being alone in exile. The films would have started anywhere from 20 to 40 years canonically from the end of Return of the Jedi. Lucas keeps the concept of creating new characters, worlds, and storylines, although they were also changed and suited to fit the situation that the films now found themselves in. R2-D2 and C-3PO would be the only characters to appear in all of the proposed sequel films. Luke, Han, and Leia would have had appearances and be in their chronological 60s or 70s, as per age and story progression of the films. Themes of the proposed storylines from the films would have had more philosophical problems such as right and wrong, confronting aggression and standing up for justice, and even passing on what you have learned to the next generation. George Lucas and other officials relating to Star Wars relegated any thoughts of sequels as being that of history, and of an unused chance to make the films due to various circumstances that had emerged from when Return of the Jedi concluded. By the early to mid 1990s, a period of 10 years had elapsed from when the original films concluded. George Lucas first announced the idea publicly to create the prequel series at this time in roughly 1992. It's now known that some film critics and theorists have assumed that the reason in part for why the prequels would be made for the original 3 films is that Lucas didn't want any other director or film studio to take over the franchise of Star Wars. Sources from 1997 and 1999 had him mention that he didn't have any ideas for any more of the sequel films, and clearly didn't want any other director to head a project to continue the original story. His studio also had a few bad investments with films, and this affected his confidence with filmmaking, and the fact that the prequels were not universally liked or enjoyed when compared to the original trilogy. Through circumstances, Disney bought Lucasfilm in 2012, which immediately alarmed some critics and analysts as to what sort of quality the future Star Wars films would be like. The first warnings about Disney meddling in the vision for Star Wars were made during this time, as Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher were all hesitant about returning to these iconic roles. When asked by Disney, it's very important to remember that they all had concerns about what Disney would do to the films. They made these accusations public as well at the time. George Lucas would be close to retiring from filmmaking at the same time roughly, and Disney knew that they could take the film rights from him at that particular time, as he eventually sold his company to Disney. Important facts about the selling of Lucasfilm were: Kathleen Kennedy would replace Lucas as president of Lucasfilm. Disney would have final say over future films. Ideas that Lucas had in terms of story treatments and details would be used, and the number of Disney employees who could see or know about these ideas were limited. All outlines by George Lucas from the 1980s and the 2010s were then handed over to Disney officials during the purchase. Shortly before The Force Awakens was released in 2015, Lucas had some final ideas and concepts for what proposed sequel films could have in terms of details. A teenage female Jedi named Kira. This is the most important deal, as the concept would be kept, modified, and changed to be Rey, as she would eventually come of this notion. A modification of the name would be used for a character in the Solo film. Friend of the female Jedi. This character was named Sam, who carried a blaster. This idea would eventually form the basis for Finn. An older Luke Skywalker, whom had exiled himself to the remote planet where the first Jedi Temple was located. This idea was later reused in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. The older Luke is hesitant about training the teenage female Jedi, but eventually agrees to. This idea was used in The Last Jedi. George Lucas envisioned for Luke Skywalker to die at the end of Episode 7. Later concepts would be used in Episode 8. Mark Hamill later commented that George Lucas originally had the ending of Episode 9 to have Luke dying instead of a cameo appearance, leaving Leia as a Jedi. Luke would have become a dark and morbid character in self-exile due to being haunted by the betrayal by one of his students. The idea of a dark and depressed Luke preceded the involvement of J.J. Abrams in the films. Luke was originally supposed to have dialogue in the first film, eventually having the now infamous speechless cameo at the end of the first film was writer Michael Arndt's idea, because he had become associated with the project after Lucas had left. The main villain would be a man named Skylar that would become corrupted by a character named Talon, until both became the same character, Skylar. Some drafts of the idea had the character being not related to anyone. Skylar ultimately became Ben Solo, This controversial idea was actually Lucas's, not J.J. Abrams, as his backstory was to be explored in Episode 7. Disney knew that to attract the older fans, Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher had to reprise their iconic roles. It would be extraordinarily important to give validity and credibility to the future films under Disney control to have these iconic characters in the said films, unlike the prequels, which divided fans due in part to the lack of having iconic and relatable actors and actresses from the original 3 films in the prequel installments. Prior to Disney buying Lucasfilm, those in Hollywood as well as critics knew how Disney had operated with their properties and likenesses, and knew that it could be, eventually undeniably be catastrophic for the Star Wars films and related merchandise. Disney had desires and motives for the films to be heavily catered to millennial audiences, and for licensed toy sales also aimed at them. The existing fans have been some of the most loyal and sensitive out of any fictional film franchise, but Disney opted to go with the sort of angle that they'd be willing to follow any future done, regardless of the quality of the said film. News reports had a good amount of millennials not exactly eager for Star Wars, unlike prior generations, as this had alarmed Disney for their long-term profit margins with the Star Wars franchise. Perhaps the biggest conspiracy with Disney's involvement with reactions to the Star Wars films is the Rise of Skywalker's reviews on the Rotten Tomatoes website. It's a well-known and respected website that can easily make or break a film's reputation, especially with a casual movie audience base. Throughout the release of the film remained at an odd 86% fresh approval rating, which seemed odd because even as more reviews were put on the site by people who had seen the film, the number remained at an even 86%. It did not go higher or lower than that number. Words soon emerged that Disney had bought out Rotten Tomatoes' score to keep the film's credibility high, to encourage people to see the movie, even though reviews were saying that it wasn't that good of a film at all. Mark Hamill was a very vocal critic of the Disney buying of Lucasfilm and of the treatment of the Star Wars franchise, and even with the fans associated with the films. He mentioned many times to countless interviewers and news sources that the films couldn't be that good, and criticism or suggestions from key officials being George Lucas himself, Harrison Ford, among others, were ignored on purpose by Disney. According to film analysts, at first no one really thought that much of it, but after the film's releases, people began to gradually take what Hamill had to say seriously. The divisive responses to the films and the opinions of the men and women whom had worked on the films gave credibility to all of the claims and accusations that Hamill had made. However, eventually Disney had heard of Hamill's claims and told him to stop and to be quiet, lest he face legal issues from the company, as Hamill eventually stopped voicing out to media about Disney and released a tweet promoting the films and obeying the Disney policy. But it's now accepted that Hamill did warn fans and viewers of the films that they would be exceptionally bad and potentially destroy the Star Wars name in the process. It's also important to know that in the period of time shortly after the release of The Rise of Skywalker in theaters, fan reception was mostly overwhelmingly negative. Even those whom had remained open-minded during the prior movies voiced concerns with all of the films released from 2015 through 2019, and publicly wondered and voiced concerns if this would be the direction in which the films and the franchise would be heading. Disney later realized that the fans weren't going to go away, nor were they going to just accept what they had in mind for the Star Wars franchise. Excessive internet theories about the possible end of the film or alternate film scenarios that the films could have taken or had were readily discussed online. The intensity of the fans wanting something more than what was given to them, as many were unhappy with the films. Some of these theories were credible, while others were nothing more than just speculation and fantasy, but it showed just how dissatisfied and angry fans were after being left seeing the movies and re-evaluating the sequel trilogy. As long as the prequel and sequel films are considered in valid continuity, these films would be despised and disputed by long-term fans of the franchise and confused by the lack of substance by casual movie audiences.